The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
Abductions are high-profile cases that have a devastating emotional impact, not only on the victim's family, but on the entire community. As detectives, we are under immense pressure to locate the child and apprehend the perpetrator as quickly as possible. The lessons I learned from this case will remain with me forever. There are images that I will never be able to erase from my memory, but there are also many extraordinary parts of the investigation that I'm proud to have been a part of. Lindsey Wade. In My DNA, my career investigating your worst nightmares. Well, welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. I am your host, Jill. Well, this is episode 101, She Who Fights Monsters, part 3 on In My DNA, my career investigating your worst nightmare by retired Tacoma detective Lindsey Wade. I highly recommend listening to the first 2 parts so that part 3 makes more sense. So previously, we saw Lindsey Wade, now a homicide detective with the Tacoma Police Department in Washington, who has honed her investigative skills as she has worked in sex crimes, on cold cases, and homicides, coordinating with other law enforcement agencies, her knowledge of DNA and its investigative use growing. Back in 1980, an unknown assailant broke into Susan Lowe's apartment, sexually assaulting and strangling her to death. The investigation was rigorous, but with no new leads, the case turned cold. A DNA profile was finally developed and submitted to the various DNA databases with no matches. Looking into the case, Lindsey was horrified to discover a glitch in the matrix. Well, Lindsey learned that some of these SVPs did not have their DNA profiles uploaded and would not until their release, which might never happen. And she worked 2 years on fixing this and getting these additional profiles uploaded. Now, each year, the DNA databases grow with new felon DNA profiles added. And in May 2012, Bellevue Police Detective Jerry Johnson finally received amazing news on a CODIS match from a civilly committed sexual violent predator named Michael Halgren, who was linked to this unsolved 1980s homicide of Susan Lowe. Lindsey's hard work already paying off. Halgren had been detained at the Special Commitment Center on McNeil Island 12 years earlier, and his DNA had never been taken until Lindsey Wade pushed, and she was just elated. This was a huge win. Back in 1980, Halgren was working as a machinist in Bellevue. He lived 3 blocks away from 19-year-old Susan Lowe's apartment. At the time, Halgren was interviewed by Detective Johnson, with him saying that he was engaged and would never cheat on his fiancée. He had bought marijuana near Susan Lowe's apartment, but had never met Susan Lowe. But now, in 2012, confronted with the DNA match, he said it could have been a one-night stand. He didn't remember for certain. Well, a civilly committed SVP, Michael Halgren's criminal history was frightening. Convicted of rape in the first degree in 1989, he'd abducted a woman he saw on her way to work. Dragging her into his van, he assaulted her, but a nearby police officer interrupted, with him ultimately going to prison. But by 1995, Hallgren was back on the streets, picked up a prostitute who was actually an undercover cop. In his car, he attempted to bind her with zip ties as she literally jumped out of the moving car, with a Seattle police officer witnessing all of this. Hallgren was arrested again and charged with unlawful imprisonment. Sentenced to 60 months. Instead of being released, he was detained by the SCC when his sentence was up. While at SCC, Hallgren admitting to raping more than 20 women after he left the Air Force in 1975. A peeping Tom, he'd exposed himself over 40 times. He also admitted to fantasies of stabbing, shooting, and strangling women. Hallgren eventually pled guilty to murder in the second degree and was sentenced to 14 and a half years in prison. While Lindsey was exhilarated that Susan Lowe's murder was finally solved, her mind rolled back to the murder of the tweens, Michella Welch and Jennifer Bastian. Those cases were still frozen solid since 1986. Murder bookies, I think you'll agree that Lindsey's preference for investigating cases involving the most vulnerable victims, children, is obvious. The oldest case in Tacoma was the abduction of Anne Marie Burr, an 8-year-old girl who was snatched out of her bed as the household slept. Can't quite imagine that one. Oh my God. Some suspect that Anne Marie may have been Ted Bundy's first victim. But would it be possible to solve this case after 50 years? Lindsey thought about what Anne Marie experienced, recalling her own childhood memory of waking and finding a strange man in her bedroom. Anne Marie Burr went missing from her home on North 14th Street, August 31st, 1961. It was located a few blocks away from the University of Puget Sound, a private college Bundy later attended briefly. She was tucked in around 8 p.m., and her parents, Donald and Beverly, retired for the evening at 11 p.m. A storm rolled in during the early hours, frightening 3-year-old sister, Mary. Anne Marie brought Mary to her parents' bedroom because little Mary had a cast on her broken arm and it was bothering her. All taken care of, she was put back in bed. Later, Mary again appeared at her parents' bedside. Mom took her back to bed and noticed that Anne Marie's bed was empty. Alarmed, she checked the rest of the house, and the front door was wide open, as was a living room window, and Anne Marie was definitely gone. A white picnic bench from the backyard had been placed along the wall of the house by the living room window, which was unlocked for the TV antenna. No cable back in these days, guys. Everybody had antennas. And the intruder kidnapper's entry point was revealed. Whoever had snuck in went upstairs, picked up Anne Marie, and walked out the front door with her. Well, the police were called to the Burr home, arriving around 5:30 a.m. They told the officers that their dog had barked at some point during the night, but with the storming, they had no idea what time it was. Nothing had been stolen. Fingerprints were taken. A partial palm print from the bench was never identified. Tips came in and were investigated, suspects polygraphed, incoming phone calls were monitored, known sex offenders were questioned, massive land and air searches were conducted, and Anne Marie Burr was never found. This crime was high risk. Entering the house with a whole family sleeping inside was daring. Abducting a child and exiting without a trace, ballsy. Ted Bundy was never identified as a suspect in the Burr case, however. 10 years later, Bundy was revealed to be the prolific serial killer and escape artist who was eventually captured in Florida in February 1978. He was executed at Florida State Prison January 24, 1989. Ted grew up in Tacoma, attending the Hunt Middle School from 1960 to 62, and then Wilson High School from 1963 to 65. Real estate records show that his parents, Louise and Johnny Bundy, bought a home on North 20th Street, September 3rd, 1965. Louise sold this home in 2009. Getting settled in, the new owners of the Craftsman home found some unidentifiable burnt material in the attic, and knowing that this was the Bundy house, they called the police. Well, Lindsey fell over herself, having a chance to be in the Bundy house, seeing where Ted grew up, as we all probably would. A forensic specialist checked out the burnt material and determined it was just vegetative plant material, which we all keep because it's so precious, yet I store all of my burnt plant material in my attic. So that's really strange. What the hell is that? Well, all of this got Lindsey thinking. So in December 2010, she began researching whether Ted Bundy's DNA had been collected and if it was in the various DNA databases. And she learned that no, Ted Bundy's DNA was not in the Washington State CODIS, since he wasn't convicted of any crimes in the state. Okay, well, he certainly had been convicted in Florida, so she contacted District 8 Medical Examiner's Office in Bradford County, Florida. Had they maintained any tissue samples or blood of Ted Bundy? Well, a few weeks later, in January 2011, a reply came that the blood collected during his autopsy was used to generate an RFLP DNA profile, which was no longer the standard DNA analysis technique being used. An RFLP DNA profile could not be uploaded to CODIS. So in 2004, a request was made to update the profile to the newer STR technology, but there hadn't been enough remaining material to do so. Okay, that's a problem. So Lindsey is on this now. She next contacted Dave Kaufman at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Kaufman replied that no DNA profile of Ted Bundy had been uploaded to CODIS because he had no luck in locating a reference sample needed to be processed. Well, Lindsey thought and said that she would contact crime author Ann Rule. She knew from reading The Stranger Beside Me as a kid that Bundy had written letters to Ann Rule. Perhaps the stamps on the letters might have enough DNA on them. Well, this now gets Kaufman thinking. There's a Bundy museum in the Florida crime lab where the wax molds of Bundy's teeth taken during the Chi Omega sorority murder investigation were on display. Right? That's kind of gross, but I get it. But maybe they held some of Bundy's DNA. Well, now Lindsey contacted the Sonoma County cold case detective, Jim Schwarf, who she knew was acquainted with Ann Rule. Scharf contacted Rule, who was willing to provide Ted's letter to help Lindsey get Ted's DNA. Now, this is a peak experience for Lindsey Wade. A week later, she had lunch with Detective Jim Scharf and Ann Rule, the honor of a lifetime, reading the woman who had inspired her to go into law enforcement. Ann Rule gave her 3 envelopes, a handwritten letter from Ted, and a copy of his fingerprint card taken in Florida. The stamps appeared to be the lick-to-stick type, so game on. The next question. This is complicated, guys. How did the mail system work in Florida prisons? Making calls and digging deep, Lindsey learned that inmate stamps were purchased in a commissary-type store, and sometimes stamps were sent by family or friends to the prisoner. Sending a letter, the inmate would address the envelope and affix the stamp and put the unsealed envelope into the prison system to be read by prison personnel, who then sealed and mailed the envelopes. And she played a lot of phone tag to confirm that this was the procedure in 1986. So June 2011, Dave Kaufman called following up. He'd only obtained a partial DNA profile from the wax molds of Bundy's teeth. However, he had tracked down a blood sample taken in Pensacola the night Bundy was arrested, March 17, 1978. The question was, after 30 years, would it still be viable? It turned out to be putrefied, dry, and rotten. But it didn't matter. 6 days later, a full DNA profile for Ted Bundy was obtained, decayed or not. Fantastic. Mission accomplished, right? Wrong. Okay, make sure you're sitting down because this made my blood boil. Because this blood was taken before Ted Bundy's conviction, and because the executed confessed serial killer was not currently in custody, it could not be uploaded to CODIS. Well, what the hell? All right, I'm sure you, like me and Lindsey, we are all incredulous. Quote, Ted Bundy didn't qualify for the National DNA Database. Ted Bundy is the poster child for the National DNA Database. He was a cross-country serial killer who evaded capture because law enforcement had no way to connect him to the horrendous crimes he committed across numerous states. End quote. Now, this has come up before, but it deserves retelling. Former Los Angeles police detective Pierce Brooks had the idea to use a computer database to track serial murderers across the United States so law enforcement could connect similar crimes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, across states and the country. And in 1983, Brooks testified before Congress about what VICAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, would do. In his testimony, Brooks used Ted Bundy as the example to demonstrate how a country-crossing killer could have been stopped earlier if VICAP existed. Irony of ironies. Now, due to bureaucratic BS, only Florida would be able to run DNA tests against Ted Bundy's profile. Wrong, just wrong. Frustrated, Lindsey nevertheless suggested that Kaufman send out a bulletin to law enforcement agencies everywhere that Bundy's DNA profile was on file in Florida. Kaufman also requested that VICAP notify CODIS administrators in all 50 states, as Lindsey notified Washington State's HITS, Homicide Investigation Tracking System, with more bulletins going out. All right, this is just madness, by the way. It's just madness. Well, a can of worms was opened, and the powers that be took their heads out of their asses. I'll tell you what I think. They decided to upload Ted Bundy's DNA profile to VICAP under a new category called legal. While not in the offender index, legal would be searched in its own category. So it did finally happen. So far, there have been no matches, but this is offset by the huge backlog in processing rape DNA kits. So hurry up and wait. And again, good for Lindsey, doing what I certainly never imagined needed to be done. This took grit and steely-mindedness, and she got it done. Now, a few years afterward, she got to meet the original Ted detective, Bob Keppel, who she idolized for his work on Bundy and the Green River Killer cases. Now, this is just adorable. She brought a bunch of Keppel's books with her to have him sign them, but got there and felt foolish, fearing she'd look like a groupie, and left them in the car. So I do stuff like that so I can really appreciate it. I've talked to you about my fangirling experiences here. So Lindsey, I get you. But still, she got to sit with Bob Keppel in his home and talk about Ted, and it was an amazing thing to behold. Now, a few years after Bundy's DNA profile was uploaded, Lindsey met with the authors Stephen Michaud, who were interviewing Gene Miller and Lindsey for a book that he was writing about Bundy. He published 2, The Only Living Witness and Conversations with a Killer. When Ted was living on death row in Florida, Stephen Michaud spent several months interviewing him. Now, early on, Bundy professed his innocence. But Michaud employed a method by which Bundy could speculate about the type of person who committed the crimes, dodging taking personal responsibility for them himself. This reminds me a little bit of O.J. Simpson's book, The Tiny If I Did It. Yeah. Bundy gave Michaud details only the killer would know. Both Lindsey and I have read these books over and over. And by the way, in 2019, Netflix did a series, Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes, based on these books, and it is definitely worth watching. So August 4th, 2014, during Lindsey's short drive to the station, she heard a news alert. A 6-year-old girl was missing from the jurisdiction next door. Something in her gut told her it would not end well. And coincidentally, August 4th was the 28th anniversary of Jennifer Bastian's abduction in Tacoma's Point Defiance Park. Well, Lindsey was now the assistant coordinator for CART, Tacoma's Child Abduction Response Team, who regularly assisted other agencies as needed. She and Lieutenant Rob Jepson would meet with fellow CART member, FBI Special Agent Kyle McNeil, at the command post across from Puget Sound, where the landscape was much more rural. Phones were ringing, radios crackling, volunteer searchers were being organized, deputies were coming and going. 6-year-old Janice Wright was missing and urgently needed to be found. Shoulder-length raven hair, a toothy grin, just adorable. Her parents last saw her on Saturday, August 2nd, between 10 and 11 p.m. when she went to bed. She wasn't reported missing until the next day, just before 10 p.m., when her siblings said they couldn't find her. The 911 call was made by her 12-year-old sister. Her father spoke to the dispatchers, not sounding too concerned. He believed she was at a friend's house. Janice was described as a free-range kid who wandered about the trailer park where they lived. Well-kept and considered safe, there were just over 100 mobile homes in the park. Kids played regularly in the woods nearby, and a single road provided access into the park, and this was soon closed off. But law enforcement had questions. Why had Janice's parents waited 24 hours to report her missing? Now, police work from the inside to the outside in a multi-tiered investigation when a child goes missing. And this delay in figuring this out would focus resources on the parents. For some context, in 2022, in the United States, 203,900 children were victims of family abductions. 28,200 children were the victims of non-family abductions. And 115 children were the victims of the stereotypical kidnappings. So stranger abductions is really, really rare. All right, assistance was requested, and FBI agents began looking for registered sex offenders living within 2 miles. Others began interviews. 2 Tacoma police detectives were assigned to speak with Janice's mother, showing her a pair of underpants and shorts found in the woods. Were these Janice's? The mom was sure that the panties were, but she was uncertain about the shorts. That doesn't bode well. With no obvious progress, Lindsey called her friend, Kathy Decker. Remember Kathy Decker, the man tracker? Well, Kathy arrived at the command post, bringing a second man tracker with her, and the Washington State Patrol Crime Scene Response Team began processing Janice's residence, searching for clues as her family was put up in a hotel. It would be an incredibly difficult week where Lindsey couldn't help thinking of her own daughter, seen through the baby monitor, given the extra long hours that she was working. Lindsey began creating a detailed timeline of events related to Janice's disappearance, using all reports, witness statements, and records. 2 Team Adam consultants from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children arrived to assist. These are the retired law enforcement experts on child abductions and kidnappings. The man trackers found an area of interest in the woods that was in close proximity to where the blood-stained underpanties and shorts were found the day before. But no Janice. As Lindsey continued to construct the timeline, DNA results came back on the clothing that they'd found. It was likely Janice's blood. An unknown male DNA profile was developed from the semen on the panties, and this DNA did not match Janice's dad or anyone else in the database. Inwardly, Lindsey groaned. Semen on a little girl's panties was a thing of nightmares, a horrifying picture of sexual assault that Janice had likely suffered. With the DNA evidence, a DNA canvassing was initiated in the mobile park. Consent forms came out, swabs swiped cheeks. Now, dozens of DNA reference samples were being processed by the crime lab with priority testing. Several men from the park seemed suspicious. One had left the area in a U-Haul around the time Janice was last seen. Another refused to allow his vehicle to be searched the night that Janice went missing. When police attempted to speak with 17-year-old Gabriel Gaeta at his family's mobile home, his mother said he was too distraught for an interview. He was curled up in bed in a fetal position and wasn't speaking. Could they come back? Well, this is really odd. Very odd. That's a red flag to me. August 7th, 2014. Canine dogs had now joined the search, and Lindsey began running background checks on the suspicious males. Around 11 a.m. came the awful news that Janice's body had been located by the canine dogs in the woods. Hope evaporated as the mood grew brittly somber. The focus now turned to finding a killer. Lindsey headed out to the body recovery site, having a deja vu moment recalling when Zena Linnick had gone missing. Janice's body was partially submerged in a muddy bog. A wooden pallet had been placed over her body, hiding her from view. And this was very close to where those clothes were found and the area the man trackers had identified. With over 400 law enforcement and support personnel continuing work, DNA was finally collected from Gabriel Gaeta, the 17-year-old in a fetal position. Lindsey requested and received a list of all registered sex offenders in Kitsap County with no DNA in CODIS. And meanwhile, the autopsy on Janice came back. She'd been sexually assaulted, suffered blunt force trauma to her head, and had been strangled. Saturday, Lindsey had to attend a family wedding. Oh boy, she in the mood for a wedding, right? Not fully able to let go of the investigation, she brought her work phone with her, just in case. And it rang. There was a match to the unknown male DNA with a male in the trailer park. 17-year-old Gabriel Gaeta, who had been arrested without incident. A search of his bedroom revealed clothing stained with blood and mud. While he never admitted what he did to Janice, he told them that nobody else was involved. Gaeta was a high school wrestling star and a friend of Janice's family. He had attended the local vigil for Janice, and his mother was interviewed about the missing girl. And in the video, Gabriel is sitting next to her in Mom's car. So fast forward to February 2017. Judge Forbes ordered Gabriel Gaeta's admission to the Western State Hospital for competency restoration after he was found unfit to stand trial. During this period of observation, suicidal ideation was noticed, with him refusing the psychiatric medication. Gaeta then violently attacked staff members. Kitsap County Superior Court ordered that he be involuntarily medicated, which led to him being deemed competent to stand trial. He ultimately pled guilty to aggravated first-degree murder and first-degree rape of a child, and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Well, throw that key away. In the Kiss of Daily News, Janice's grief-stricken grandfather, Orlean Almohera, said, quote, "We are all so sad, angry, and heartbroken that we will never get to see our granddaughter finish elementary school, high school, graduate, attend college, get married, and have children of her own." End quote. Mother Denise Wright spoke of Janice's, quote, "upbeat attitude, liveliness, precociousness, and intelligence. You could tell she was going to be a special little girl. Her smile and friendliness would brighten up anyone's day. She was the sunshine in our family, and now it's gone." End quote. That poor little girl. This poor family. I'm so glad Gabriel Gate is off the streets. Well, back in 2012, Jean Miller had applied for a grant from the National Institute of Justice to solve cold cases with DNA. Diving into unsolved homicides, Lindsey and Jean also included sexual assault cases. With Detective Brad Graham joining in, they reviewed dozens of rape cases where the rape kit had never been tested. 30 cases were submitted to a private lab for DNA testing. And while reviewing these cases, Lindsey always looked for cases that were similar to the unsolved murders of Michella Welch and Jennifer Bastian. There was a good chance that other cases existed, and the dots had just not been connected yet. One case caught her attention because the victim was a young girl and the crime was so brazen. A summer night in 2000 in Parkland, 9-year-old Shanna Parker came across a stray dog following him. Well, eventually the dog got away from her, and a man who was outside the Parkland Care Center told Shanna he'd seen where the dog went, offering to take her to the dog and her puppies. Not the puppies. Oh, not the puppies. Shanna followed the man into a field, and instead of puppies, Shanna was sexually assaulted and brutally raped. Alive, Shanna walked home and told her mom what happened, with the Pierce County Sheriff's Department notified. Shanna was taken to the hospital as detectives began canvassing the area. After interviewing several residents of the Parkland Care Center, a man, Antonio Nieves, was seen with Shanna, agreeing to help the little girl find some puppies. However, showed a photo lineup, Shanna did not pick Nieves out, and the case went unsolved. Being Lindsey, she now called the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab, inquiring as to whether Shanna's rape kit was processed for DNA testing. Well, it had been back in 2000, and a male profile was obtained. The file recommended getting a reference sample from the suspect, Antonio Nieves, for comparison. In 2008, there was a match in the DNA database from her rape kit, Antonio Nieves. But this was not reported to the Pierce County Sheriff Department as a CODIS hit, as it was a conviction hit. Wait, a what? A conviction hit? Lindsey had no idea either. Inquiring, Lindsey was told that this term is used by the crime lab when an offender provides a DNA sample as a result of a conviction. It is assumed that a generated match is tied to the evidence used to convict. Thus, these hits are not reported to law enforcement. Okay, but what if a particular rape kit is not part of the evidence used to convict the felon? Oh, God. Well, researching, Lindsey learned that Antonio Nieves' DNA was taken as a result of a felony conviction unrelated to the rape of little Shanna Parker. Sharing this news with the crime lab supervisor, he was stunned. The match between Shanna's kit and Nieves was overlooked, never reported. Quote, "This case was a perfect storm of missed opportunities," end quote, Lindsey writes. Well, damn. So, Lindsey now called the Pierce County Sheriff's Department's cold case detective, Tim Coble, whose reactions ran both ends of the spectrum. Yay, a match, but what the hell? Reopening the investigation, Antonio Nieves pled guilty in 2015 and received a 20-year prison sentence, and Shanna Parker finally got justice. Yeah. See why I love this book? There's some tough stuff here, but there's some real justice happening. So 2013, reports on the 30 samples of DNA began coming in. There were 2 hits for stranger rapes by a name that Lindsey knew, a very bad guy, Andre Taylor. The first case took place at McKinley Park. Do you remember Donald Schneider at McKinley Park from episode 1? Well, on July 19th, 2019, the police were dispatched to the park, and they found victim Marcy Bennett lying in the street, partially undressed, crying, covered with debris. Taken to the hospital, she said she'd been offered a ride by a black male on Puyallup Avenue. Driving to McKinley Park, she vaguely recalled being assaulted, with him threatening to get a gun from his car as he struck her over the head a number of times. A rape kit was collected, but this case was not investigated further. A second case happened 4 months later in November. A hysterical 41-year-old woman, Samantha Carmen, told Tacoma PD that she was walking to a friend's home when a man approached her on foot, wanting to know if she wanted to make some money. Ignoring him, she continued to walk. He grabbed her from behind, dragging her into an alley, saying he'd choke her if she screamed, and raped her. When finished, he fled on foot. Canine dogs tried to track him, but he had escaped. Samantha was taken to the hospital, but walked out. A decade later, she explained to officers that at that time, the responding cops didn't seem to believe her. She was then left alone in a room for a long time. And she'd had enough, and she left, walking home alone. Oh, God, how horrible is that? Well, fortunately, a Tacoma police forensic tech had collected the semen sample from the alley, which had been deposited by the unknown suspect. 10 years later, this semen swab came back to Andre Taylor. Lindsey had run across Taylor a year earlier in another investigation. In February 2012, she was digging into the database to see if she could find a solid lead for investigator Ryan Larson. On February 17th, Susan Lee was walking home after working the night shift and noticed a blue Chevy truck following her along 72nd Street. Passing her several times, she diverted, cutting across a parking lot, when the truck followed her and hit her from behind. The driver, a black man, tried to pick her up, with the commotion attracting the attention of a Good Samaritan who tried to intervene. Susan called 911 and provided a partial plate, 104N or a 10N in it. With significant injuries, Susan underwent 2 surgeries. Scanning reports for a blue pickup truck with the partial plate digits, 3 reports popped up. Dismissing 2, the third was the charm. It was a sex offender, failed to arrest warrant, and it was dated September 21st, 2011. The suspect was Andre Taylor, a level 3 registered sex offender living in Puyallup. His vehicle was a blue 1994 Dodge pickup truck, license plate B96610N. Taylor's wife hadn't seen him and said he took the truck when he had left. Looking up Taylor Andre J. in the sex offender registry, he had been convicted twice for rape. So wait, why is this guy not in jail? First offense, Taylor went to an acquaintance's apartment saying he needed a place to stay. Letting him in, she left to go to bed, with Taylor following. When she told him to leave, he pulled a gun, raping her, and would terrorize and stalk her afterwards. This resulted in the first count 1 rape. Count 2 went back to an incident in 1995. Taylor went to the home of an 18-year-old female, waking her up. He made advances towards her, and she told him to stop, only he didn't want to stop and sexually assaulted her. Other convictions involved burglary and theft. Now, I love this phrasing. He was deemed non-amenable for treatment at the sex offender treatment program. Level 3, Taylor was at high risk to reoffend, and the warrant for his arrest went out. Lindsey and Detective Brian Vold then went to speak with Susan Lee at the Tacoma General Hospital, conducting a recorded interview. She told him the story of walking home at night around 4:30 a.m., being stalked and struck by the truck. He had then apologized and he said he'd take her to the hospital, picking up her phone, but did not call 911. Screaming for help, Susan snatched her phone back and dialed herself. Struggling to stay conscious, eventually she gave the phone to the Good Samaritan who intervened, and the suspect drove away. Next, Lindsey acquired Andre Taylor's cell phone records, which was on a female's account. Driving to this address, the blue truck was parked outside. Surveillance was set up as Lindsey updated the prosecutor, who in turn updated Taylor's failed to register warrant with the judge signing off on it. Shortly thereafter, exiting the apartment, Andre Taylor was detained. Speaking with Detective Larson, Taylor admitted hitting Susan, but it was an accident. He never intended to kidnap or sexually assault her. Yeah, arrested for first-degree assault and attempted kidnapping, he would be found guilty. Now, Lindsey had 2 back-to-back CODIS hits on Taylor. She followed up on the Samantha Carmen investigation, with Brad taking the lead on the Marcy Bennett's case. Samantha came into the station, clearly recalling, even though many years had passed. Marcy Bennett was harder to track down, but she too was willing to cooperate and get him convicted. Now, 911 calls, they're stored for a few months, but as Lindsey dug into the investigation, she was delighted to find that both these 911 calls existed. However, the witnesses were unwilling or unable to participate. So, September 5th, 2014, Brad and Lindsey interviewed Andre Taylor from jail. He had no idea why his DNA would have popped up in either case. When, quote, she showed him a photo of the white milky liquid left in the alley, Taylor asked her if it was his, end quote. Oh boy. Both the Carmen and Lee cases were charged and tried by the deputy prosecuting attorney, Sven Nelson. Taylor opted for a bench trial before the judge with no jury and was found guilty. And in January 2018, Andre Taylor was sentenced to 26 and a half years to life in prison. Going to be a pile of keys being thrown away today. Ooh. Now, back in 1986, the lead detective on the Jennifer Bastian case was Wolf Werner, a big hulk of a man with a German accent. Now, based on the similarities between Jennifer's case and Michella Welch's, Werner believed that the same deranged perpetrator was responsible for both girls' murder. Thousands of tips had come in, leads were followed, saliva, hair, blood samples were taken, and many were ruled out by DNA. Regretful at not solving the case, Detective Werner retired in 2008. And if he saw Lindsey, he always asked about Jennifer's case. It never left him. In 2009, Lindsey had taken a 5-month maternity leave after giving birth to her daughter. Leave was over, and she jumped right back in, canvassing a case for Jean Miller, who is now head of the cold case unit. Examining the crime scene photos, they were really the worst Lindsey had seen in her long career. Thinking of Jennifer Bastian, quote, the terror she must have felt during her last moments on earth was something I couldn't shake, end quote, which motivated her even more to find this killer. Lindsey met with Patty and Ralph Bastian for the first time in 2003, and their need for answers was painful. As this meeting was ending, Ralph grabbed Jean Miller's arm. Quote, he didn't have much more time, and implored us to find out who'd killed Jennifer. That moment was absolutely gut-wrenching, end quote. In May, Jean and Lindsey headed to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children for a case review, presenting the Bastian case to a panel of 20 experts organized by retired FBI profiler Jennifer Bastian. She and Lindsey had kept in touch since Zena Linnick's murder. After a robust discussion and deep dive, some new investigative ideas were generated. Jean submitted Jennifer's swimsuit to the crime lab for DNA testing, and hairs were sent to the Minnesota Department of Public Safety crime lab for mitochondrial DNA testing, the best technology could offer at the time. Mitochondrial DNA passes through the mother's line, but as there is no mitochondrial DNA database, this requires a suspect sample for comparison purposes, and none existed in Jennifer's case. The hairs came back as originating from a common source, but that was not Jennifer. Then, in November 2013, the lab called Jean with an update on Jennifer's swimsuit. They had a male DNA profile. Oh my God, Jean was shocked. The original investigators assumed that Jennifer was likely to have been sexually assaulted after her swimsuit was removed, so they hadn't tested it before now. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS with no match. But significantly, it did not match the DNA profile from Michella Welch either. Investigators were thunderstruck. For a long time, they assumed that these cases were connected, and now they knew the Welch and Bastian cases were not connected. There were two twisted killers out there. Dozens of suspects had been eliminated because they were incarcerated or alibied during one of the murders. Now they all needed to be revisited. Jean began compiling lists of suspects, including those who had not been eliminated with DNA, collecting voluntary samples, and these initial ones were all eliminated. They asked the crime lab to send the unknown suspect's DNA to the CODIS manager in every other state with a request to do a keyboard search on the profile in the individual state databases. So unfortunately, not all DNA profiles are equal, and some are just not good enough for the state or national databases. In other cases, there could be a match in a case from another state that hadn't made it into the national database. But again, there were no matches. Lindsey spent months researching old records and old reports. She looked by location, name, age, type of victim, weapons used. If she saw a case that caught her interest, she noted it. If a suspect was named, she ran a background report, checking criminal history, and determined if his DNA was or wasn't already in CODIS. It seemed that every suspect was worse than the previous, which is simply terrifying, even for a seasoned veteran cop. Lindsey took notes while watching true crime programs like Forensic Files or Dateline. If she came across a suspect who committed a similar crime in 1986, she'd note the name and then run a background check the next day at work. She knew many perpetrators are highly mobile and could have committed crimes in other states. Well, time was rolling on. In January 2015, Detective Jean Miller retired, with Lindsey taking over the cold case unit. Now, she and Patty Bastian had gotten to know each other really well, becoming really close, and Patty would begin volunteering her time to help. Jennifer's father, Ralph, passed away in 2015, never learning who had murdered his little girl. Now, Lindsey learned about an innovative technique that identifies the surname from Y chromosome DNA, which had led to the identification of a suspect in two cold cases out in Phoenix, Arizona. The woman who assisted the Phoenix Police Department was Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick. Quote, a rocket scientist turned genealogist and founder of Identifiers International, end quote. Dr. Fitzpatrick explained that the Y chromosome is passed down from father to son along the paternal line, so the men sharing this Y STR were likely to share the same last name. Adoptions or children resulting from a secret affair or boys with their mother's last names would also pop up. So let's give this a go. Lindsey asked the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab to obtain a YSTR DNA profile from Jennifer's case, and it was sent in for analysis. 3 surnames popped up: Smith, Washburn, and Holbrook. Well, Smith is fairly useless given the number of Smiths out there in the world. But searching the Jennifer Bastian case file, there were no Holbrooks referenced, and there was only one man named Washburn on file, Robert Washburn. In May 1986, after seeing a composite drawing of the Michella Welch suspect, Washburn had called in a tip. He said he was jogging at Point Defiance Park, and he saw a man who resembled the sketch. If he saw him again, he would try to get his license plate. So this tip was called in about Michella's murder 3 months before Jennifer Bastian was murdered. Washburn was interviewed in December 1986, and there were no red flags identified, and he was determined to be a low-priority guy. Lindsey also reached out to Dr. Barbara Ray Ventnor, the genetic genealogist who helped Paul Holes catch the Golden State Killer, but she was unable to make progress given the DNA had degraded. In August 2015, Lindsey began working with Parabon Nanolabs. Then they were offering cutting-edge DNA testing called phenotyping, which identifies ancestry, hair, skin, eye color, racial morphology, and freckling, and could create a computer-generated composite of what the suspect might look like based on the DNA. And in September 2015, they got results. He had European ancestry with blue or green eyes, blonde or red hair, fair with some freckling. In 2016, with no DNA matching, Lindsey decided to do a robust spring cleaning, taking every male name in the case file and putting it into a web-based, searchable database. Painstaking, tedious work, reviewing every report, note, teletype, offender list, field report, criminal history, photos, whether DNA was or wasn't in CODIS. I cannot stress what an enormous undertaking this was. When completed, 2,300 names were categorized, and only 350 had been eliminated by DNA or incarceration. During all of this, the FBI helped finance the work done by Identifiers and Parabon, with FBI Special Agent Terry Postma assisting in the investigation. He also tracked down some elusive suspects from out of state. 2016 was also the 30th anniversary of the murder of Jennifer Bastian. Now, this all coincided with the annual CART, Child Abduction Response Team exercise. But instead of focusing on an Amber Alert, the public information officer presented the digital composite of the unknown suspect created by Parabon. A tip line was staffed, and this was a success with 120 new tips coming in. New funds from the U.S. Marshal Service paid for additional DNA testing. Lindsey also helped to track down blood spot cards from deceased suspects, and this DNA was tested too. 121 new DNA samples were collected, and an additional 40 from out-of-state persons of interest. Many potential suspects lived off the grid, were transient, homeless, and one was in carny work, working in a circus. Hoarders, filthy, disgusting men were approached. And you have to read this part of the book for yourself because it is just yuck. Now, Lindsey began sending DNA samples collected during the CART exercise out for testing. Time to hurry up and wait again. In August 2016, Lindsey gave a presentation at the International Homicide Investigators Association Symposium on missing offender DNA and CODIS, which had become her passion, understandably. Finding the offenders who had slipped through the cracks was crucial in fixing the system. And after months of waiting, the results were all negative, no DNA matches. The second batch was sent out, and months passed by, and no match. Then the third set went out. Guess what? No match. Paraphrasing now. By the time the final batch was sent out, Lindsey was discouraged, to put it mildly. So many promising suspects, but no match. Growing pessimistic, on call for 14 years, and with no partner now, she had burnt out. The work spun you in circles, the results swerving and elusive, and she needed a change. The Washington State Attorney General's office had won a $3 million grant, the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, to inventory and test unsubmitted sexual assault kits from all over Washington State. So Lindsey decided she would retire and take on this job. But she had to tell Patty Bastian. Leaving the Tacoma Police Department after 21 years was hard. Leaving without solving Jennifer's case was painful, and her last day was bittersweet as she turned in her gear and went out for a celebratory lunch. Lindsey didn't cry until she got home. April 16th, 2018, she began the new job with great people and a great purpose. About 3 weeks later, so this is May 8th, 2018, her Tacoma Police Department cold case unit replacement, Detective Steve Riopelli, called her and asked her if she was sitting down. Well, yeah, she was. Why? She heard Riopelli say, quote, "There's a match on Jennifer Bastian," end quote. Lindsey has no idea what she said next. She only recalls emotion bubbling up, gurgling something that didn't actually resemble words, silent tears falling, choking up as she croaked out, "Who?" Robert Washburn. 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 The YSTR DNA surname. Robert Washburn, the guy who called in the tip about seeing someone suspicious in Point Defiance Park after Michella Welch's murder 5 months before Jennifer was abducted. Robert Washburn had killed Jennifer?
Yes.
Robert Washburn had killed Jennifer. Washburn had one previous arrest for criminal trespassing dating back to 1985. He was interviewed in 1986. In this report, he was listed as other, not suspect. Because he had no criminal history, he's classified as a low priority. The only reason Lindsey had added Robert Washburn to the DNA collection list was his last name, given to her by Dr. Fitzpatrick. While FBI agents went and knocked on Washburn's door and collected a voluntary DNA sample in his apartment in Illinois on March 6, 2017. White male, green eyes, he fit the phenotyping predicted by Parabon Nanolabs. I think something sick in this guy was triggered by Michella's murder, causing him to insert himself into the Welch investigation. And then when he couldn't stand it anymore, he followed up killing Jennifer, living out some kind of sick fantasy of his. According to the Washington State Child Abduction Murder Study, 10% of suspects interject themselves into investigations. 9.7% contact the police or media. 23.7% return to the body disposal site. And I suspect Washburn did too. And this confirms the belief that a suspect's name is usually in the case file, and that name can be listed as a benign entry, not necessarily a suspect. Quote, It is difficult to describe how much this meant to so many people, including me. Most probably thought it would never be solved. I hoped that perhaps clearing the untested rape kit backlog might provide a match someday, or there would be cold hits in CODIS, end quote. But she surely never thought that would happen 25 days after she retired. Shaking, Lindsey went in to help Detective Rio Pelli sort through the massive case file for references to Washburn. She saw her old boss, tears in his eyes. The plan to arrest Washburn. Tacoma PD detectives flew to Illinois to get him. As soon as he was in custody, Patty Bastian would be notified in person. And this was an emotional roller coaster, and Lindsey second-guessed her decision to retire. If she hadn't, she could be arresting him herself. Thursday, May 10th, Robert Washburn was arrested for the first-degree murder of Jennifer Bastian. Lindsey and Assistant Chief Sean Gustafson drove to Patty Bastian's home at 8 a.m. Patty answered the door looking confused, having just awakened. Whatever rehearsed speech Lindsey had prepared vanished, and she blurted out, quote, "We got him," end quote. Patty looked unsteady, and then tears began to flow. After a few questions, Patty called her daughter Teresa, breaking the news. And then they called former detective Wolf Werner, retired a decade now, and he was elated. And Lindsey called her mom, who cried more than Lindsey had. Calls came in from childhood friends, remembering how Jennifer Bastian's death had shaken them all up as kids. It was so great that this case was finally solved. Whew. Washburn declined to be interviewed by detectives Rio Pelli and Ryan Larson. Told his DNA matched, he denied killing that little girl. Shortly after the arrest, an inmate contacted police saying Washburn had confessed to raping and killing Jennifer Bastian. He then backpedaled, saying he had come across her bike and hid it in the bushes, and looking around, he found her body and masturbated over it. Then he changed his story again, saying he'd raped and strangled her. He had been jogging and looking for sex. The inmate said Washburn had said he was a, quote, sick, kinky fuck, end quote. Over the years, Washburn had kept track of the Bastians and knew her father had passed away. Eventually, he'd say he wanted the death penalty and didn't want his family to know what he had done. Really? Okay. Washburn would eventually plead guilty, sparing Patty and Teresa a trial. Lindsey was in court when Patty and Teresa gave their victim impact statements on what 32 years without Jennifer had been like. Patty described how on a nice summer day, there was, quote, always a cloud of fear and foreboding. We continued to live and laugh and love, but in a much different way, end quote. For the community, the simple act of, quote, walking to school became a logistical nightmare, end quote, as kids were no longer allowed to play outside. Teresa Bastian said, quote, you made me an only child, end quote. The judge sentenced Washburn to the maximum allowed in 1986, 26 and a half years in prison. The judge would read a written statement for Washburn, who wrote, quote, I strangled her until she died. I'm deeply sorry for the death of Jennifer, end quote. Teresa thought he was insincere. Patty would tell the News Tribune, quote, the epitome of a guilty man. He can't look you in the eye, end quote. But the fear of this killer being out on the street was gone 32 years later. 32 years. Tacoma residents, friends, and family of Jennifer Bastian waited for justice that finally came. Lindsey writes, quote, it was an honor to have contributed to the resolution of a case that had such a powerful impact on the entire community, end quote. In 2019, with Lindsey pushing hard. After several years of testifying before state legislators and committees, Jennifer and Michella's law was passed in Washington. Now, why does it take years of this? Why are our legislators so inept at passing laws that save lives? Please bring back common sense. So Jennifer and Michela's law strengthened Washington's DNA collection law by expanding the number of qualifying offenses which would require the submission of a DNA sample upon conviction. It also allows law enforcement to submit DNA from deceased convicted felons to CODIS, regardless of the conviction date. Well, they finally got there, and the loophole was closed. Lindsey wraps up the book, reflecting back on her impressive, amazing career. Quote, "Being a detective who also happened to be a female of color gave me a unique perspective on the crimes I investigated and the interactions I had with victims and their families." End quote. She recalls a family member of a Black homicide victim who feared that nothing would be done to solve the murder because, quote, "it was just another Black man," end quote. That fear was not borne out, and Lindsey solved the case. Retired now, she still Googles the names of perpetrators that flit across TV because seeking justice will always be in her DNA. The respect and admiration I have for Lindsey knows no bounds. Now, as Lindsey was writing this book, 12-year-old Michella Welch's murder investigation was not included because the suspect was awaiting trial. Well, here comes 2ndCast. I'm now going to tell you everything I can about Michella Welch's murder in 1986. Michella Welch is much more than a victim. She was 12 years old, petite, with long blonde hair and glasses. Nicole Ebby spoke to ABC News about her big sister. Quote, "She was just a beautiful child. She loved music and was an amazing artist. She played the piano, she played the violin, she loved to read, and was definitely the bossy older sister." End quote. So in March 1986, Michella, Nicole, and other sister Angela went to Puget Park in Tacoma around 10 a.m. Michella then realized they'd forgotten their lunches at home. No problem, she'd go home and get them, as her sisters went off to find a bathroom. Michella returned, set the lunches on the table, and went to look for her sisters. When Angela and Nicole returned, they found Michella's bike, but no sign of her. The family had this yoo-hoo whistle they used, and Nicole would say, quote, "And we yoo-hooed, and we didn't hear her," end quote. By 3:10 p.m., officers arrived at the park, and the search for the missing girl began. A 13-year-old classmate later told detectives he saw a man in the park that day under the Proctor Bridge who kept looking at the girls. Well, this man was never found. Around 11:30 p.m., a tracking dog found Michella's body in a makeshift fire pit area gulch, about 50 yards or 45 meters off the nature trail. She had been beaten and sexually assaulted, her throat cut. Coordinator of the Explorer Search and Rescue, Grant Smith, said, quote, "Her hands were clutched tight and were all muddy. She must have put up a real struggle," end quote.
Oof.
Thousands of tips were investigated over the years, but the case turned cold. In 2006, a DNA profile was developed from the evidence. However, the killer's DNA did not match any of the DNA profiles in the national database. In 2018, Tacoma police detectives gave approval to Parabon Nanolabs for the killer's DNA to be uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genetic genealogy database which permits this type of search. Now remember, you have to opt in at GEDmatch. You have to opt in if you want your DNA profile to be used for investigative purposes. Now, from GEDmatch's DNA, genetic genealogy identified two brothers who did live in the area in 1986, as possible suspects who were immediately surveilled. On June 5th, Gary Hartman went to his job at Western State Hospital, where he worked as a psychiatric nurse, having breakfast with a colleague. A detective took a discarded napkin that Hartman had used and submitted it to the state crime lab for testing. The lab found a match between the DNA on the napkin and the DNA from 1986. The decades-long hunt for the killer was over. The married father of two, with no criminal record, Gary Hartman was arrested, pleading not guilty. A neighbor of Hartman's was shocked, saying, quote, "You never expect the face of somebody who's done something this terrible to look so normal." End quote. Yeah, you're not kidding. Way too common. On hearing that Michella's case was solved, Lindsey Wade said, quote, "I am relieved. I'm happy he is in custody and happy we were finally able to give Michella's family some answers." End quote. Michella Welch's family attended Hartman's court hearing. Nicole Ebby said, quote, "I'm just thankful that the court system can do its job now and that it was through DNA. You can't argue with it." End quote. And Hartman was held on a $5 million bond. In May 2022, after a bench trial, Pierce County Superior Judge Stanley Ramah found Gary Hartman, age 70, guilty. The judge said, quote, "There are no excusing conditions for your behavior. You are guilty of one of the most malignant and depraved crimes." End quote. Sentencing Hartman to 26 years and 6 months in prison. The convicted child rapist and murderer cried throughout the proceeding, as Welch's mom, Barbara Leonard, Angela, and Nicole spoke about Michella. Later he would say, quote, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. God knows I'm so sorry. That doesn't help. I'm just sorry. I'm just sorry." End quote. Hartman, who used a walker in the courtroom, will likely die behind bars. Speaking to KOMO, Barbara Leonard said, quote, "I say lock him up and throw away the key, and now he will pay the price. However, it will not bring her back, but justice will have been served. It's a great relief he's been sentenced, and I can't say whether or not he feels true remorse. It's not up to me, but one would hope so. And I think we'll find out someday in the judgment of God if he is really repentant." End quote. And that's where I will end episode 101, She Who Fights Monsters, on In My DNA, My Career Investigating Your Worst Nightmares, by the amazing Lindsey Wade. Whoa, there were some heavy-duty stories in this. And I'm so glad all of those monsters are behind bars. And announcing our next book, Harvest of Innocence by Dan Steedham and Tom McCarthy, on the West Memphis 3. Oh boy. I met Dan Steedham at CrimeCon 2024 in Nashville, and I could have listened to him all day. Now, this isn't just about the murders of some children, a breach of justice, the complexities of 3 defendants accused of murder 30 years ago, but it is also the impact the case had on his life as well. This is his personal story, not someone researching or digging into a case. He lived it. So read with me, or let me tell you the story with my usual analysis, research, and updates. So thank you for listening, Murder Bookies. I see you as you hear me. Take a few minutes to leave an awesome review that will help me make Noodle Murder Bookies, and I will be sure to shout you out in the next episode or so. Share with me your thoughts at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com and on X, Facebook, Instagram, and we are now on YouTube. Links are on my blog, and you can still join Patreon for $4 a month That's www.patreon.com/Murder Shelf Book Club. See you in 2 weeks, Murder Bookies. Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music, The Pewter Elephant by Blue Dot Sessions.